So first of all, I would like to take a moment to welcome you all and to introduce myself. My name is Teresa Blumenstein, and I have the privilege of being the coordinator of the Justice Coalition of Religious, which is a coalition of 22 organizations that represent Catholic sisters, brothers, priests, and their mission partners at the United Nations. And in our work at the United Nations, we are dedicated to representing the collective mission of increasing justice and peace that is held in common among all congregations. And so we are very excited and pleased to have this group together today. There are, in fact, many members of the team who work together at the United Nations who are here on the call today, as well as many of you who are joining this session as representatives and as experts from different nations around the world who will be participating in a major UN conference this July. So we're very pleased to have all of you together in one room. And I am very much looking forward to the opportunity to learn with you and prepare with you in these next 7 months as we prepare for this major UN conference and ultimately prepare to engage in a long-term observation and monitoring of the status of justice and peace in each of our respective places in the world. So we will begin this session and all the sessions going forward just to come together in a brief prayer, which is emblematic of a common thread that unites all of us, though we are coming from many different places, different languages, different backgrounds, different ministries, and different congregations. So we will begin with that word of prayer. Gracious God, let our hearts be settled in you today as we celebrate the meeting of our many different paths and callings. Let us rejoice in the opportunity to become better acquainted with new partners and friends from many corners of creation. Let us be awake to your presence within each of them. We are grateful for this new opportunity to serve you as the source and substance of our common mission and identity. We are humbled to be entrusted with the service and promotion of social, economic, and environmental justice in our local communities and in our global community. Guide us in our efforts to collaborate and change systems so that we may more effectively sow your generous light and love where they are needed most. Amen. So we have the great pleasure of having a pretty large group together today. So as we begin the call, I would like to invite all of you who are here to just take one moment to introduce yourselves in the chat box, if you are able to do that on your device. Your name will appear automatically when you send a message. So if you could share in your message perhaps a congregation that you are part of or that you are connected to, and what country in the world you are joining us from today. Then we can each see who is in the room with us and what community we have gathered today. So we will just take a moment for each person to locate the chat box and share a message of your congregation and your country. Oh, beautiful. So we have representation from Latin America, from Africa, from South Asia, a few who are in New York, the UN. We have Europe. Absolutely wonderful. So thank you all for taking the time to share that. And if you have not yet found the chat box or you are still typing, please continue. We'd love to receive your introduction there. And I do apologize that we don't have time for proper introductions for everyone, as I would love to hear from each of you. But in our time available today, we will dedicate to the topics that you see on the screen before you, which are talking about what is the Justice Coalition of Religious, this group that has brought you together today. What are the Sustainable Development Goals? And what is the role of religious congregations in the system of the United Nations, as well as the SDGs, which is our shorthand for the Sustainable Development Goals. So that will be our focus today, but I will just say briefly that there will be another time, multiple other opportunities in our program over the next several months where you will have the opportunity to share more about your individual experiences and ministries, and I'm very much looking forward to that further down the road. So first, I'd like to say a little bit more about what our coalition is and why we exist. So the full name of the group is the Justice Coalition of Religious, but more often we just refer to our group as JCoR or JCoR or JCoR. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a team, a group of women and men religious and those who work with them for global transformation through the system, the
Solo le dio la
opportunities of
constancia
the United
porque
Nations,
vino con mucho miedo, dice
as
Margarita.
well
Se
as
fue
in
ella quien
other
lo atendió, yo
places
no
around the
lo
world.
atendí, entonces ella solo.
So this coalition is comprised of 22 organizations who are representing Catholic religious. And each of these organizations has an accreditation with the UN system that allows us to participate in various proceedings and conversations with the delegates of government to the United Nations, as well as to representatives of different UN agencies, those who are not representing governments at the UN, but who are part of the UN organization itself, who help to run the agencies that you hear so much about. Each of these organizations has representatives at UN headquarters, which is in New York City. And each of these organizations is committed to a common mission of improving the well-being of people who are living in poverty, as well as the well-being of the natural environment. As a group, we have a presence in over 100 countries around the world. And just to pause for a moment here, these are the names of the organizations who have come together to form JCoR. And you will note that with this list of 22, several of them are groupings or charismatic families in and of themselves. And so several of them are actually representing many congregations under one organization. And so in this list of 22, we actually have almost 200 congregations represented. And of course, with any grouping like this, it's very important to have a common mission, a common purpose in mind. And so the goal that brings us all together for our UN work is to enhance the collaboration among our members, both those who are working at UN headquarters and those who are working around the world, in our work to address the root causes of poverty, violence, environmental destruction, and unsustainable development. So in addition to the many ministries that our congregations have had for a long, long time that address the symptoms of these problems, we also wanted to enhance the way we work together to address the causes, why these problems exist in our world today. And so just to give you a sense of who participates in this work and who is included. These are images from some of our workshops and gatherings that we have had in different corners of the world. Some of you may even see yourselves here, or perhaps members of your congregation. This is just a very small subset of the workshops that we've had. Images here from Bangalore, India, from Guatemala, and from Zimbabwe, where we gathered people from Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Uganda. And a few more. An image from Uganda, from Ecuador, and another from India, this one in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu. So within these images, we have many congregations represented, many, many different ministries represented, but all can be united under that common cause. And so in addition to participating in this program for the next few months together, you also have ongoing opportunities to connect with JCoR and all that we do, as it is not limited to just this program or the conference for which we are preparing. So at any time or for purposes outside of this program, Those who do have a representative for their congregation are always able to contact the UN office for their congregation. And here we have the images of many of our current UN representatives. A few former representatives are in that image as well. And of course, I'm available as well for both those who are represented already at the UN, as well as those of you who may not have representatives at the UN. You can always contact our UN office for JCoR itself. We have a website, jcor2030.org, that offers lots of information about all of our activities and things we have done in the past, as well as programs like this one, and opportunities for learning and for action, statements that we have made. And we also have a monthly newsletter, our bulletin, that goes out. So if you would like to subscribe to that, you can get updates in your mailbox. And we also have accounts on Facebook, on Twitter, or X, as it's now called, as well as a YouTube channel, which where we will have recordings from all the sessions of this program as we proceed. So if you miss any of these sessions over the next few months and you want to return to see what you missed, they will be available on that YouTube channel. Okay, so that is the bit about introducing JCoR itself. I'll just take a moment to pause here and take a look around the room and see if there are any questions that anyone would like to raise. And if you do have a question, you can just put up your hand if your video is on, or you can also use the reaction button in order to raise your digital hand, and I will be watching for both of those. Okay. I'm not seeing any hands, so I will proceed to the next section of information for our session today, which is to discuss a bit more about why and how it is that religious congregations, such as those of which you are part, are engaging with the United Nations system, and how it is that we're able to add or contribute something to the proceedings of the UN. And this always feels like an important place to begin in our learning and our preparing to participate in any part of the UN system, because there is a common sense or a common perception that the United Nations is a place that is very political, and that perhaps that is not a space for people to offer leadership from a spiritual background, or to offer wisdom from a spiritual background, that it's not a place for religious leaders or even for just regular people, citizens of the country, but that it's only a place for very high-level conversations, and it's a place for politicians to meet one another. And then that's not a place for us. However, what we will discuss over the next several minutes is, in fact, what the nature of the UN system really is, and why there is a place for religious leadership, spiritual leadership within the process and the proceedings of the UN. So I will begin this discussion with why we feel compelled to join this particular forum and this particular conversation when it is so much about political leadership, and in more recent years, also a place where we've seen a lot of corporate leadership, or in other words, leaders of industry, major executives from giant corporations and businesses. So why do we feel compelled to join this kind of forum? And of course, like so many things, our response and our desire to contribute to this space is something that is inspired by Catholic social teaching. And just to very briefly recall some of the key pillars or tenets of that teaching, we are called by this teaching to be in solidarity with all people, to recognize that harm done anywhere to anyone is harm done to ourselves. And similarly, that justice anywhere is justice for all. And so we are called, in essence, to always be aware of what is happening in the wide world around us, to feel the pain of others, and to take up the call to respond to that pain as though it was very much our own personal experience as well. And so a forum like the United Nations offers an opportunity to both have an eye on what's happening in the world, and also to be part of the conversation in which we seek to respond to the pain, to the cries of the poor, of the earth, to reply to the woes of the world. Catholic social teaching also recognizes the rights of workers and those who labor, and there are very many aspects of the UN system that touch on the rights of workers. Rights and responsibilities as a whole are, in essence, the main structure of the UN system in creating texts and agreements that allow for us to speak about universal human rights that apply to everyone, and to fight to make sure that those rights are respected and protected. And of course, the teaching also calls us to have concern for the poor, which is some of the central concern behind the UN system, is to reduce inequality and to ensure that all people enjoy a certain basic standard of living and quality of life. The teaching calls us to care for creation. And certainly you may have heard in the news, especially recent years, that significant part of conversations at the United Nations are dedicated to responding to the environmental crises that we are experiencing as a planet right now. Our teaching also calls us to family, community, and participation, which is to say that where there is an opportunity to be involved and to contribute, we should do so. We should not be satisfied by just tending to our own small life and work and staying satisfied as individuals, but to be part of the larger fabric and web of our society, and to even see our global society more and more as family. And of course, at the heart of everything is the concept of human dignity, which is truly the ground or the foundation underneath the concept of human rights. It is that we all share in this dignity. It is God-given dignity, and therefore, even whatever country that we are living in or wherever we are, we always have this dignity and we always have our human rights. From the UN side of things, we actually see significant reflection of these same ideas, these same principles that are part of our Catholic social teaching. And we even see that some of the language really is very similar to the language we use in our own Catholic social teaching. And I bring up one particular document. The UN is full of countless major documents, but perhaps the most important for our place to begin is the UN Charter, which is essentially the mission statement of the United Nations. And that mission statement begins with a very important phrase, which is "we, the peoples of the United Nations." And I underscore the word peoples here because right from the very beginning, from the creation of the UN system, with this phrase, we are saying that the UN system is not and was never meant to be only a meeting place for political leadership. It was always meant to be a place where the peoples of the world could meet, could learn from one another, could hear about one another's experiences, and could work together to improve that collective experience for everyone. And of course, there were many reasons that we wanted to have that kind of space when the UN was created. And so the charter goes on to say that the reason that we've come together as the peoples of the world is to save the next generations from the scourge of war. They say they want to reaffirm faith in human rights and in the dignity and worth of the human person, to establish conditions for justice, to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom, to live together in peace as good neighbors, to maintain international peace and security, to ensure that armed forces shall not be used, and to promote the economic and social advancement of all peoples. So in other words, with this document, the UN gave birth to a new space, not only for meeting and talking, but a space in which we could understand the complex problems that plague us as a human family, and to seek to respond to them in a unified way as a collective. And while we recognize that, of course, the perfect world that is imagined by this charter, we have not yet achieved it. The UN system itself is not perfect, and the world around us is certainly not perfect. But what we have here is the birth of a place to simply allow for that conversation, that exchange of ideas that can hopefully day by day bring us closer and closer to the ideal world, the peaceful world that is envisioned here in this charter. And I mentioned earlier the human rights framework. So just to be a little bit more specific about what that consists of and includes, the human rights framework are a series of major agreements among the nations of the world to uphold certain ideas and rights for all people who are within their borders. And so those include many different categories of rights, including what we call the universal human rights, which include things like the real basic necessities of life and life in dignity, such as the access to food, to shelter, to healthcare, to education. We also have a covenant related to protecting civil and political rights, which involves participation in society and opportunities to have a voice in your society. There are economic, social, and cultural rights, which include things like rights to work and to labor under safe and reasonable conditions. There are documents dedicated to eliminating discrimination against women, as well as discrimination on the basis of race or ethnicity. There's a convention on eliminating torture and other foul treatment and war crimes. There are frameworks on the rights of migrant workers and their families, the rights of persons with disabilities, and a set of special rights that are available, or not available, rights that belong to all children. And so again, as with the UN Charter, we can see here many reflections or hear many echoes of the principles of Catholic social teaching, but perhaps just changed a little bit into more secular language, but very much supporting those same wheel of principles that we spoke about a few minutes ago. And a much more recent aspect of the UN systems framework, which we will talk about in great detail as we go forward, will be something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And this, in essence, is the agenda for the entire UN system, all of its many, many agencies, all of the governments who are members of the United Nations, all of the civil society organizations like ours, who participate in the UN's conversation. Everything is directed around these 17 goals. And that began in 2015 and will continue to be the agenda for the next several years until 2030. And while we won't go into great detail about these goals today, I just invite you to take a moment to view what is included in these goals on your screen. And I'll just go through the short version of them briefly to let them wash over you and try to absorb the ideas that are included here. Goal number 1 is to end poverty. Goal number 2, to end hunger. 3, allow for good health and well-being for all. 4, education for all. 5, gender equality. 6, clean water and sanitation. 7, affordable and clean energy. 8, decent work and sustainable economic growth. 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. 10, reduced inequalities within countries and among countries. 11, sustainable housing and infrastructure for cities. 12, responsible consumption and production of goods. 13, action to address climate change. 14, preservation of life and ecosystems below water. 15, preservation of life and ecosystems on land. 16, establishing peace through access to justice and strong institutions that provide good governance. And 17, partnerships among all sectors, among all governments, among all peoples, to allow for the other 16 goals to be achieved. And so in a way, we can think of these 17 goals not only as the UN agenda, but another way of looking at it is a secular roadmap to what we would call the city of God, or perhaps the kingdom of God, or the reign of God. Because of course, if we were to imagine such a place, a heaven, it would include the kinds of features that are described here. This is what we're working toward as people of faith and as secular people of goodwill. So the mission is very much shared, as we can see here. Another way of saying that is to say that even the political is spiritual. And this is an illustrative quote from a former UN Deputy Secretary General, Jan Eliasson, who said that it's important to realize that there is an element of spirituality needed in what we do. And here he was speaking of what we, meaning we at the United Nations, do, requires an element of spirituality. He said, in order to stop the trend of dividing humanity to us and them, the most important word in the world is together. And so that ending of division applies also to this division between secular efforts and endeavors and religious or spiritual endeavors. Those people of goodwill who identify under either of those banners need to work together and to have a common agenda. A further form of support for this idea of the political is spiritual comes from our colleague, Dr. Aza Karam, who was a senior advisor to the UN Population Fund for many years, and then also moved on to direct a group called Religions for Peace. And she is a Muslim scholar and theologian. And she shared, along with a dean from Princeton University, that the United Nations and its agencies deal with a very wide range of issues. And religion often plays a powerful, complementary, moral, social, economic, and political role for disenfranchised communities. Every religious tradition has leaders and networks who are providing services like food distribution, healthcare, education, and conflict mediation. And religious social service networks, which preceded the UN and preceded many of the governments of the world, today still reach more people and are more deeply entrenched in a community than any other organization. So here, Dr. Karam and Dr. Weiner were speaking of the important role of religious leadership in addressing the very mission of the United Nations, saying basically, governments can't do it alone, and they should not try to do it alone, because here is the great wealth of wisdom and experience and community connections that are available through religious social service networks, and that there is a vital need for leaders of government and leaders of industry to seek the partnership and the guidance of religious leaders. And furthermore, if those were not convincing enough, there's also a beautiful statement from the current UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who shares that the spiritual dimensions of the work of the United Nations tend to be overlooked and underappreciated. Yet, the tenets that are set out in the Charter, which are peace, justice, equality, the dignity and worth of the human person, echo the teachings of the world's religious traditions and summon us all to reduce human suffering. As we reflect on the papal encyclical Laudato Si, the state of our common home is broken. This presents an epic policy test, but ultimately, this is a moral test. So here we have the UN Secretary General, who, by the way, produced this statement as a foreword to a reading guide that was published for those who are reading Laudato Si. So first of all, that shows a close relationship there between a diplomatic leader, the world's foremost diplomatic leader, and the leader of the Catholic Church. And here in this foreword, what he's saying is that when it comes down to it, when we take away all of the political terms and the conventions and legal jargon that we find in UN documents, yes, we are working to create good policy that addresses the problems of our world. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the test that we are facing, the challenge that we are facing, is a moral challenge. We do need to search our souls and find the will, the political will to do what is right for each other. And so while we can have all of the beautiful words in the world on paper, they won't amount to real change, and they won't serve people unless we find it within our hearts and our spirits to make good moral decisions and really pursue that common good. Then from the other side of things, we also have some spiritual leadership offering the sentiment that as people of faith and as spiritual leaders, we should also see our work as having political elements and dimensions to it. So not only is the political space of the UN a spiritual space, but here now, on the other hand, we have spiritual leaders saying, in fact, spiritual spaces have political elements as well. And so we hear that from Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, when he says that politics remains a lofty vocation and, in fact, one of the highest forms of charity, inasmuch as it seeks the common good. Openness to the transcendent can bring about a new political and economic mindset, which would help to break down the wall of separation between the economy and the common good of society. So here he's saying political spaces need an element of spiritual transcendence in order to help all people rise to the great challenges that are presented and to help us create a new and more just world. In addition, we also hear from Pope Benedict in Deus Caritas Est that the Church cannot and must not remain on the sidelines in the fight for justice. She has to play her part to reawaken the spiritual energy without which justice cannot prevail and prosper. Efforts to bring about openness of mind and will to the demands of the common good is something which concerns the Church deeply. So here a call not to be bystanders, not to be spectators to the political arena in our world, but to be aware and to seek to have a voice and to have influence in the interest of the common good. And finally, once more from Pope Francis in Laudato Si, we're also called to recognize that the spiritual is indeed part of all dimensions of development, as we might name them, the social elements, the political elements, the financial or economic elements, the environmental or natural elements. These are all integrated with spirituality. And he says this by saying, we're faced not with separate crises, one environmental, the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integral approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time, protecting nature. So in other words, from all of these quotations and inspirations taken together, we are called to participate in an integral world by taking actions that involve an awareness of the many different moving pieces that comprise our lives as humans, and recognizing that we won't have justice and we won't have peace until we can get those pieces connected and aligned in a way that allows for a reduction of inequality and allows for the human dignity of all people, and that respects the common good of all life on this planet. So after putting a lot of information in front of you in a short amount of time, I would like to invite us all to just take a quiet minute to reflect on, again, that graphic that I showed you of the UN agenda, those 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I have this slide in a few different languages, so I will scroll through them as we go. But just to say that the Sustainable Development Goals, again, thinking of them as a reflection or a roadmap to the city of God, I would invite you all to take a minute to look at this agenda and see if you can see yourself, your ministry, your congregation here. Do any of these speak to you particularly? Do you connect to them? Do you relate to them? Where do you see yourself and your work reflected in this agenda? So we'll just take a minute to do that quietly. And if you wish, as you reflect, I would invite you to again return to the chat box and maybe just list 1, 2, or if you really want 3 different goals from this list that you feel are most connected to your ministry or to your congregation's mission and charism. And so in that way, we will get to know each other even better as we continue through our session today. So I will show this in Spanish as well. Unfortunately, because Portuguese is not a UN language, they don't have this graphic in Portuguese. But hopefully between the images and the English and Spanish, we can all get a sense of what the goals are here. And then you can just put in the chat box the number of the goal that you feel most connected to. So we'll take a quiet minute just for that reflection and that sharing in the chat box. Thank you all very much for that. I'm learning a lot about you quickly, and that's one of the beautiful things about this agenda, these colorful set of goals, is it allows us to speak kind of a common language, which connects us not only as religious groups with the leaders of the UN system, and to help us see our work as common, to see our work as integrated. But it's also a really quick way for us to see commonality with one another, whether we're in very different parts of the world or very different types of ministry, helps us quickly see patterns and connections in the goal of the work that we're doing. And from your responses, I saw definitely a lot of emphasis on those first 6, 5, and 6 goals, especially poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equality, water and sanitation, a lot of emphasis there. And then especially another emphasis further in those environment related goals, the climate action, life underwater, life on land. There was a lot of energy there as well. So thank you for introducing yourselves a little more deeply through that exercise, which I will be going back to look at all of your responses in detail to come to know more about you. And again, we will in future sessions have more time for you to share more about how it is that you and your congregations are working in these different areas that require so much love and attention from all of us. So if you did not yet put the goals that you work on in the chat box, please go ahead and do that sometime between now and the end of the session, as that will be a good reference point for us going forward. So please do put that in the chat at some point. And now I'd like to just pause once again, since that last segment involved quite a bit of information, and just ask if there are any questions or perhaps even reactions or comments that you might like to share after hearing all about why the religious congregations are engaging with the UN system. And again, as before, you're welcome to raise your hand just by raising your actual hand on camera or by using the reaction button and raising your digital hand. Yes, I see Cecilia O'Dwyer. Please go ahead, Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And that was just beautiful, the way you presented the spiritual dimension, you know. I'm just so aware that over the years, yeah, we've been kind of really deepening our understanding of that spiritual dimension of why we are at the United Nations. I think we all knew why we were there, but it was very difficult to put words on it, you know, at times. And then on the other hand, over these years, both the UN itself has begun to capture the huge need to incorporate a spiritual dimension as well. You know, I think that part of it is really interesting. And then from our own church, the connection between our spirituality and the political. I think that's made a huge difference as well for all of us. So it's really been, you know, quite an increase of awareness, I think, which is very lovely.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. And I should add, I have an image I share sometimes of some of the artwork that we can find around UN headquarters that really pulls on spiritual tradition as inspiration for the conversations that happen at the UN. And I will include that actually in when I share the slides from today. I will include that artwork.
Right.
Because it offers further a deepening of the sense of that spiritual inspiration that is required, and that the leaders of the UN are really trying to bring into that space so that the diplomacy can happen, because diplomacy at the end of the day is not so much about one country forcing another into an agreement, but it's meant to be a space in which people can have a change, experience a change or a transformation in their mind and their heart, and hopefully so that all countries arrive at a place of greater truth than they were before that encounter. And so when we think about diplomacy as changing hearts and minds, when we think of spiritual transformation, then it becomes easier to see how that is also the mission of spiritual leadership, is this idea of changing minds and hearts to move closer to truth. And so it's very spiritual work and requires spiritual inspiration and spiritual openness to encounter other people and other ideas. And that's what we're trying to do in that space. I also see the hand of Michelle Loisel. Michelle? Thank you, Michelle. Yes, Melba.
Voy a hablar en español ya que tengo la oportunidad.
I'm going to speak in Spanish since you gave me the opportunity.
Ok. Estoy muy contenta, Teresa, de
I'm
estar
very happy,
aquí,
Teresa,
de estar aquí.
for the opportunity of being here.
I was in English, that's why I did.
And I'm very happy to see how you presented the work at the JCoR's work at the UN, and the presence of religious and lay, Catholic religious and lay at the UN, at the foundation of the UN, and how important the role of our principles was in the very beginning of the UN. So I feel it is a privilege to be here. It gives us a new hope in this very convoluted time, with impregnated with so many challenges. We're in the middle of war, in the middle of poverty growing. Everything is growing, because growth is causing further poverty, further hunger, further violence, further lack of access to anything. And therefore, it is very appropriate today to be here in this meeting. And it also gives us the opportunity to see the spiritual character, or the spirituality that is understood in a larger sense, because all our actions, as Sister Michelle mentioned, has an advocacy aspect, which has a political incidency at a certain point. All our declarations are somehow political. If I declare I am against war, this is a political statement, despite me saying it from my faith. So the opposite of being political is being indifferent nowadays. And all of us who are privileged enough to be here to promote the kingdom of God, or the city of God, is amazing, because we have the responsibility of speaking up for those who don't have this privilege. I'm speaking from Honduras, and we feel that we have run out of time. We need to start acting right now. We need to act. We have chosen certain goals, but we cannot pick them and choose depending on the place where we are. We cannot say in Latin America, oh, I'm not concentrated in poverty anymore. They are all interconnected. Of course, there are goals that seem to be more relevant because they occupy a larger space in a certain country. We can be in a country where growth and human development is very, very depressed and facing many challenges. So thank you very much. I feel at ease here in this meeting. It's the right place to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Melva. And I really enjoy the reflection that, you know, the choice is not really to be political or non-political, but in this world, it's you're either political or you are indifferent. And so that really brings home and brings to the heart this call to participation that we spoke about in the principles of Catholic social teaching, that we can't be bystanders, can't be silent in the face of injustice. Thank you very much. And I also highlight from our chat box, Sister Anatolia Muzada shared that the Presentation Sisters, International Presentation Association, have also adopted what they call Goal 18, which is prayer. So in 17, goal number 17, we see partnership as essential for the goals, but they've added goal 18, which is another essential underpinning and element is prayer for the goals. So thank you for sharing that with us, Anatolia. And I also want to address the point that was raised by Susana Coutinho in Brazil, who shared that, you know, we say that faith and life must go hand in hand. And this sums up very well why we occupy institutional spaces to build public policies and work that produce life to the fullest, so that we may have life and life to the fullest for everyone. So thank you, Susanna, for bringing in even a scripture reference as to why we feel called to work for systemic change. Because there are many, many more scriptural references that we could use to inspire that calling as well. And so that's a great one from our Gospels. I also see that there is a question from, sorry, I have to scroll further up, from Smith Amutu, who was asking two things. One, if we could see the same kind of spiritual connections between the UN system and other religious traditions, as we do with our own Catholic tradition. And while I know much more about the Catholic tradition than I do about other spiritual traditions, there are definitely elements of the common good. So while the terminology may be different in different traditions, we certainly see that all traditions are orienting us and our efforts in this human life toward increasing the common good, increasing peace and justice. That these are ideas, even the idea of solidarity, the idea of reducing suffering. These are ideals and goals and principles that we see across all major religious traditions. And so from that perspective, I would say that the charter and the mission of the UN, the SDGs, do reflect many spiritual traditions. And while it's very easy to see the connections with our own in the sometimes almost identical language, I think the connections are there across different traditions. And I also see your other question about how JCoR works with other faith-based organizations who are not part of our coalition. And I'm going to just hold off on answering that because in the next section of input, I'm going to speak a little bit more about the practical activities that we do as part of our advocacy at the UN. And so I will make sure to answer that question in that next section of input. So I see there are two more raised hands for comments. So I'll go first to Margaret Morelli, and then after I will go to Paul Ramat. Margaret?
Thank you very much, Teresa. I'm very happy to have this talk. I think I missed it last year because I came somewhere around April, May, and I'm beginning to see things testing. It tests like us. It is not like it is far away and is not part of us. I just recall when I started this work, some of my sisters were asking, what on earth are we doing at the UN? Why are we there? Why don't we come and serve people? We need to serve the poor. And I'm seeing how all this is connected and seeing what on earth we are doing here by really testing that these things, we are working for the same human person. We need to connect. We need to, even as the UN makes policies in terms of working with the member states, we are the people who are on the ground, and therefore we need to know how to work with this other body so that together we can work for this human person. So I thank God that this has come. And I am very happy that some of my sisters are here, and maybe not those who are asking these questions, but once they get on, some of them are in funeral now, once they get on, for sure, we shall be more enlightened and appreciative of what we are doing at the UN, and knowing that we are not doing something wrong or we are not in a wrong place, but we are there because God wants us to be here. And what we are doing is also the will of God to alleviate the suffering of this human person that we are serving at the grassroots and at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, you've made me think by saying, it's not a wrong place to be. It brings up the idea that, of course, is there a wrong place for God to be? Is there a wrong place for spirituality to be guiding thinking. And in my mind, I would say, no, there's no place that God should not be. There's no place that spiritual discernment and wisdom should not be included in decision making. So thank you for for bringing it up in that way. And now, Paul.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Teresa, and appreciate for bringing us this connection between spiritual dimension and political dimensions in working with the UN system. I want to raise one questions about, we heard sometimes from people within the Catholic Church that we organizations at the UN, religious organizations, speak to the UN with the secular languages, political languages, rather than from the religious or moral perspectives. So this is a questions about, we lost our identity when we go to the UN systems. We speak from the UN about with the UN languages, but we lost our identity as religious Catholics and so far. So what's your comment on that? Some perspective or comments on that questions, or yeah.
Thank you, Paul. And that's a great question. Essentially, you know, are we required to relinquish or to give up our spiritual identity in order to operate in such a secular space? And as I see it, the short answer is no. In that, one of the beautiful things about any UN meeting or gathering is you will find that people are encouraged to kind of show up and really represent their roots, to represent the place and the experience from which they are coming. And you can see that in the style of dress, that people will come in their own traditional clothing. Many business suits, certainly, but that's a choice. People are welcome to wear whatever is the typical clothing from their own place. While unfortunately, you know, there are only 6 UN languages for which they provide interpretation. Apart from that, you know, people are encouraged and it's hoped that people bring their own unique perspective and their own unique wisdom into the conversation. In fact, that desire for bringing many things together, the goal is not to wash out the differences or to kind of globalize all ideas and practices. It's not about leaving pieces of yourself outside of the conversation, so much as bringing your entire self, your whole experience into the interaction with people who have had different experiences, and therefore creating an opportunity where you can see the connection and the commonality of your experience with a different experience. So it's very much about bringing who you are, bringing your identity. If it's a spiritual identity, if it's an ethnic identity, if it is the experience of an indigenous population from which you come, if it's the experience you have as someone who lives in a rural area or an urban area, it's about bringing everything with you into the conversation. And with that, not eliminating differences, but just helping us to learn more and more what we all have in common, while at the same time retaining all of those beautiful and rich differences. So I hope that addresses somewhat the question that you raised. And I see that Jane Castillo also asked for an opportunity to comment. So please go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, thank you. I cannot see my hands up button. Thank you, Teresa, again for that input. And this is not my the first time that I hear about spiritual leadership at the UN, but every time I hear that, I learn something new, and it's a joy to be hearing that with this different or new circle that we have, and a good preparation for the coming HLPF. 2 points I would like to share. While many of us have affirmed the importance and the value of the interconnectedness of the spirituality and politics, we are also hearing this even from different religious groups in or organizations at the UN. Like, for example, the global coalitions at the UN. When we discuss about the complexity of issues, at the end of each meeting, representatives will emphasize the importance now of really bringing our values and principles at the UN, which is very much connected to our spirituality. So we have other organizations who are into it, and we're just adding up, which is good. And second point is, over the years of being here, it is not only bringing the spirituality or charism of our organization, but at the same time also to have that perspective that this is also a space where I can grow and deepen my spiritual political life. So it's mutual, and for me that's exciting, and it's challenging definitely, but exciting also, because this is the space where we are, and I'm taking this as an opportunity to grow in that, and at the same time to share that gift that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. And I think with that, we will move on to the next section of input for today, which is, now that we have discussed kind of our motivation and the why we participate as a spiritual community in this ostensibly political space or secular space. We will now move on to discuss a little bit more of the practical aspects of how we actually engage with the UN system. What do we actually do within this system? So one quick note that is helpful to understand as we begin is that within the UN system, we congregations who are accredited to participate in conferences and the conversations are understood as NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. And I know that may feel strange to a lot of us, because we think of ourselves as congregations as something different from NGOs, but at the true heart of the meaning of the term, we are in fact organizations, we are groupings that are not a part of government. They're separate from government. And so that's really the reason for that particular label. And so that's a phrase that will come up when we talk about the way that we participate. We are referred to as either NGOs or as civil society, again, which just means people who are not representing a government. And so within this UN system, there are about 30 organizations that are accredited to represent Catholic religious congregations. And collectively, those 30 groups actually represent over 200 congregations. And so now a little bit more of the practical of what it means for us to be accredited with the UN system. What does it enable us to do? So some of the main activities that are involved in our work at the UN are making oral statements and submitting written statements to major UN conferences and meetings. We have the ability to seek and hold meetings with the diplomats who are representing governments. We are able to participate in many of the UN conferences, both in New York and in other parts of the world. We can even, as part of those conferences, we can also sponsor events like panel discussions or other types of informational events inside UN headquarters or somewhere in the neighboring office buildings that are around UN headquarters. We can also contribute formal or informal recommendations when there is a new UN document or agreement or declaration that is being negotiated. We have some opportunity either through conversation with diplomats or sometimes through a formal submission process to offer our own insights and recommendations to that new document. And we also have the opportunity to submit our own reports and comments on what is happening in the nations where our communities have a presence. We can speak about whether they are making progress on human rights or not. We can speak about whether they are making progress toward achieving any of those 17 development goals or not. And specifically, we can comment on, what is working well and what is not working well, and who is being served by current policies and who is being excluded. So we can offer those insights from the direct experience of our many members who are in ministry in many parts of the world. And because these religious congregations have had a presence within this UN system for several decades now, we have had the opportunity to establish a certain reputation and a certain voice, especially within this larger community that is called civil society, which, by the way, includes over 5,000 different non-governmental organizations that are part of this very large community. But within that, we have established a certain religious voice as part of that community. And some of the key characteristics of that voice are it's a voice that's known to be expert, impartial, credible, consistent, and collaborative. And by expert, of course, I mean that it's a voice that's known to be drawing from experience, from members' work in ministry, from living and being in community alongside people who are experiencing tremendous vulnerability, who are experiencing tremendous poverty. And so that kind of experience and expertise is very valuable in this conversation. The voice is also known to be impartial because, of course, most congregations are stretching across political borders and boundaries. And so our interest as communities is not to serve one particular country or its interests, but just to serve the common good of all people, regardless of what country they are in. The voice is credible in that, of course, you all are participating in a very long tradition as religious congregations of living lives that are very devoted to really living your values, really practicing what you preach in quite a radical way. And I use radical in a very positive sense there. Something that is uncommon and worthy of note. So it's that long tradition of practicing the values of human dignity, the values of care for the environment, the way that you live lives of intentionality and great dedication to serving the common good. this reputation holds a lot of weight toward your credibility as congregations, as a part of civil society. Another very important quality to the religious voice in the UN conversation is that it is consistent. Your positions that you bring to the conversation, the principles in which all of our recommendations are rooted, are based on the constitutions and principles of your own congregations and the experiences that you've had. And many of your constitutions as congregations are older than the Constitution of the United Nations, which only came about in 1945. And certainly you're also older than many of the world's nations as we currently understand them anyway, as many of them have been formally established in very recent years. And so you bring that long tradition, those fundamental roots and grounding that are fairly stable. And this is really valuable, this stability, this consistency, because we often see with governments that a government that is very forward-looking and very dedicated to human rights on a particular issue may be very helpful and contributing well one year, and then they have an election and someone else is in leadership and they may completely reverse their position. And so from one year to the next, a government might take a very different position on a particular issue. And that sort of endangers overall progress in the types of agreements that we are able to reach as a global community. And so the role of religious organizations in this conversation is to help keep us from losing ground, keep us from moving backward when the political wind shifts within countries, and where it becomes harder to protect human rights or maybe advance human rights. The stable and consistent voice of religious organizations and other organizations is to stay rooted in principles and to always keep moving forward, never backward. And finally, the religious voice is also recognized as one that's very collaborative. And I will speak a little bit more about that in the next few minutes, but just to say that your representatives as congregations have been setting a wonderful example of working through coalitions and committees, and really setting a great model for governments about how to prioritize the common good and common goals, and really not be so concerned with individual credit or glory, but just to be focused on the goal, and to be focused on the outcome, and less concerned with who gets the credit for a good outcome. And so here are just a few images of religious and their partners engaging in different aspects of those advocacy activities that I mentioned, whether it's in public demonstration or meeting with diplomats or offering a statement as part of a UN conference or leading an event where we share some of the insights from our members' experiences. Here we have the quotation in the top left corner is sharing the personal story of a single mother from Kenya who was experiencing lack of inadequate housing for her family. And so some of the work we do is also about creating space for people who are not part of our congregations to really have their own voices heard directly in these decision-making spaces. So it's ideally not so much about us representing other people, but creating space for people to represent themselves. And here I'll say a little more about the collaborative aspect of religious who work at the United Nations. These are on the screen several of the NGO committees on which you will find very many members of religious congregations, and you might also find them leading these groups. And so this is essentially how civil society functions at UN headquarters. We organize ourselves around different issues or different areas of concern. And then all of the organizations who prioritize that concern kind of come together on a regular basis and monitor what the UN is doing about that issue and seek to have a united voice about what is needed and what we should recommend to governments. And so some of the key areas in which you will find religious leading those groups and those efforts are the committees that address trafficking, human trafficking, that address homelessness, gender equality, mining and the right to water, land grabbing, basically all of the issues around how elements and fossil fuels are being extracted from the earth at the expense of people who live there and of the entire living world. There's also a group dedicated to reducing social inequalities, to ending different kinds of social discrimination. A committee dedicated to migration and the rights of migrants. And another dedicated to the rights of Indigenous peoples. And one on how to come up with sustainable and just finances and funds to ensure that we can accomplish the work that needs to be done in the world. And I also want to point out to Sister Smitha's question, there's also a committee of religious NGOs, which includes both Catholic NGOs like ourselves, as well as NGOs that come from many other religious traditions. And so this is a particular space in which it's recognized that there is a common spiritual investment from many faith traditions, and that we have a particular way of talking and teaching as spiritual or faith-based organizations. And so that's a space where we can come together and use that kind of language and share our priorities and concerns with one another. But I will also add that in any of these committees that are on the screen, you will find not only Catholic religious NGOs, but you will find faith-based organizations from several different religions and faith traditions represented. There is quite a significant number of faith-based organizations that are part of the UN system, both Catholic, Christian, and otherwise. And we work together with all of them. So some of the reasons for us to come together now and to work in a more collaborative way as more of a coalition and less as individual organizations is that we recognize the larger phenomena or the larger signs of the times, which include that just about every congregation is at this point seeing smaller numbers of vocations to religious life. And so that really requires us to take a more creative approach to ministry and to look at ways that we can benefit from the wisdoms of our unique charisms and our unique experiences, but also to lean into and be benefiting from the strength of our common mission and to share work, to share labor when it's possible. We also recognize that, and it's very obvious in the UN system, as in many individual countries, that we're seeing political spaces are becoming more closed, more elite, more restrictive, and are making it harder for the voices of civil society, especially those who have been the most excluded or the most marginalized, are having a harder time having a voice in decision making. And so we've come together as a coalition to try to speak with a more organized and unified voice so that we can make the most of the space that we currently have, try to protect it, and to use it very effectively to bring as much experience and wisdom into a given, say, statement or activity as we possibly can. And we're kind of referring back to our earlier reflection, when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015, we also looked at this agenda and thought every congregation and every ministry can be seen within this agenda. There are many points of connection for all of us. And this is something that is understandable and accessible to all of us. And this is a way that we can reach out and get more of our members involved to bring more voices and more wisdom into the conversation that's happening at the UN. Because in these 17 areas, or 18 for the presentation sisters, we have some tremendous expertise to offer. And at the same time, we recognize that these goals cannot be achieved simply by government. Indeed, as we got from the quotation from Asa Karam, there is a need for the experience and the community connection of faith leaders to engage all people in society, not only in working toward achieving these goals, but also to be able to monitor the work of government, to hold them accountable, to be able to critique whether or not they're achieving them, and they're really achieving them for all people, including everyone, and prioritizing the poorest and the most vulnerable. And so that wasn't going to happen without serious monitoring from a broad swath of humanity. And so that was where we thought we have something to add. We have something valuable to contribute here, because we have people in many corners of the world, and they are in position to monitor and to report on how well these goals are being achieved. And so the SDGs were for us a call to mobilize, to become more involved as a global community in guiding our leaders to fulfill the promises that are being made through this agenda. And so that brings us in our last few minutes to the type of advocacy that we are looking forward to doing together through this program, and what we will be preparing for over the next several months. And that is that we're preparing for one particular conference that happens every year at UN headquarters in New York. But thankfully, we live in a world where a lot of it happens online as well at this point. So even if you are not in New York, and you will not be in New York in July, you can still be part of this process, and you can still have a voice. And so the conference that we're preparing for is called the High Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, which is a terribly long name, which is why we usually just refer to it as the HLPF. And this is the annual meeting at which we take stock or do a progress review on how well we are doing at achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And so it's an opportunity both to kind of grade ourselves, to see how much progress we've made, And where we are not making enough progress, it's a place to propose some adjustments to our strategy to help get us back on track and to speed up the progress that we're making. And so it's not only a place for governments to contribute to that progress review, but it's also a place for the whole global community, including ourselves, to bring our observations into that review. And so this is a very important opportunity for us, since we have voices from so many parts of the world, to bring those insights into the conversation. And so the way that we intend to prepare for that over the next several months is we will continue to gather in the way that we have today for a series of online calls. And you can see the first of which was today, the 15th of January. But we will meet again on the 12th of February, the 29th of April, the 20th of May, the 1st of July, and the 5th of August. And those will all be at the same time as today, except for those of you who live in a place where you switch your clocks, like North America and Europe. So for those of us who have clock changes, our time will shift somewhere in the middle. I guess it will be between February and April. We will shift our time, but everyone else, your time will stay the same. And I'll be sure to remind you when that shift happens. There will also be an opportunity to have smaller group meetings online, which we will do region by region. And by that, I mean kind of the global regions as understood by the UN system. So there will be different regional calls for the Asia Pacific region, for Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa. And in those regional calls, those will be opportunities for you to get to know one another a little bit more. And also to share more of your particular insights and experiences and observations of your own country and your own region. And so those will be dates that I'll have you select sort of within your own regional group. You'll find a suitable date and time within those two ranges that are listed here. We'll have one sometime between the 22nd of January and the 9th of February. And then you'll have another chance to meet as a region again between the 24th of June and the 3rd of July. So watch out for emails about that because that will be the very next thing that we do is you'll have that chance to meet with people in your region. And so I'll be writing to you to ask you to help select a good date for your regional group. And then between all of our calls, I will also be writing to you by email to share the slides from today, and each time I'll send the slides from each of our calls, and any other information or important links, I will share all of that with you by email. And sometimes I will also include some kind of reflection questions or little assignments or tasks to do between calls. So all of that will be sent in reminder by email. If you do miss any of our calls, which of course can happen for many reasons, you're asked to visit the JCoR website or YouTube channel to view the recording from the call that you missed, as well as look at the presentation slides or any other resource materials, and then follow up on whatever the little assignments or tasks were from that call, just as you would if you were on the call. And then finally, when we arrive, it's in the month of July, which is when the conference itself will be happening. You will be able to watch your national government make a presentation on their SDG progress, because all of that is streamed online from the UN. And each of you are here because you are either living in or have significant experience in one of the countries, one of the governments that will present their progress, because not every government presents every year. But this is the year that your governments will present. So you will have the opportunity to hear from them and to assess how well they are representing the reality in your country. And there will also be a series of other panel discussions and events that will be available online, either hosted by your government or by other civil society organizations. And you will have the option to tune into as many of those as you like. But that is optional. And then finally, we will have our own series of online events late in the month of July, between the 22nd and 26th. And we will have those sessions we call the SDG Lab. And that will be a series of 5 interactive Zoom calls, and each one of them will be dedicated to one of the themes of this year's conference. So the themes are poverty, hunger, climate change, good governance, and partnerships. So we will have one session dedicated to each of those as part of our lab. And within those, you will be asked to take at least one turn to offer your remarks or a short presentation on the theme. And so in that moment, you can offer your observations on how well your government is doing at addressing that issue in your country. You can critique the report that the government presented, whether they accurately illustrated how much progress has been made and what needs to be done. You could also offer a good practice from ministry that addresses the theme, but we will talk about all of that later on. We're still a long way away from that process. So don't worry now about the details of what those remarks or presentation should look like. That is many months away, and you do not need to be worried about it now. But just to say that that's what we are building toward is in July, being able to read a written report from your government, to watch them make a presentation before the global community, and then in these sessions to offer a response or to contribute an idea or recommendation that also addresses the same issues that the government will be reporting on. But we will work our way there. So don't worry if you don't feel prepared to do that today. That is very normal and expected. And if you are prepared to do that today, excellent. You will be even more prepared when we are actually ready to begin those presentations. So the next things that you can expect after this call are, I will be sending around a questionnaire to you that will need to be completed pretty quickly, that will offer you the opportunity to work with other members of civil society from your country. And this will be a grouping that kind of extends beyond our JCoR delegation, so beyond the people who are participating in these calls. And that group will be putting together an official statement from civil society that will be responding to your government when they make their presentation in July. And so that process of getting those groups together is beginning now. So you'll complete this questionnaire in order to be part of that group if you wish. And that is very highly encouraged, because that's a wonderful opportunity to be directly involved in the conversation that will actually happen inside the UN building during the conference. So even if you're not there, you can contribute to what civil society will be saying there live in response to your government. And then I'll also share via email a link to register for our next call. as a group on February 12th, as well as I'll send a regional email to help you find a good time to meet with just those who are in your region, to get to know each other a little better as we begin this journey together. And I will, of course, also share all of the slides from today. So if you want to review anything, you will have the opportunity, and I will share them in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So they can be useful to everyone to follow up and to study on anything that you might have missed or want to revisit. Okay, so that is the end of my input. I do apologize that we're now quite at the end of our time, but I do see that there is a hand that's been up for a few minutes now. So I do want to give Mudita a chance to speak. And if anyone else has a question that's very vital before we go on to our next session or our next steps, I invite you to raise your hand for that question, and we will attempt to respond efficiently so that I don't keep you for more than another couple of minutes. So Mudita, please go ahead.
Yes, just an observation and a curiosity and something that I'm really very interested about and which I see as the most existential crisis today. And that is what I missed in the religious advocacy at the UN is climate change. There was a group or a congregation working on mining and fossil fuels and hunger and poverty and different things, the minorities and the migrants and different things. But what for me seems to be the most urgent existential problem today is climate change. And if congregations work on climate change, many of the other sustainable development goals fall under that. If the planet is saved, everything within the planet will be saved. But if the planet sinks, there is no use of our working for migrants and poverty, and everything sinks with it. So the first and most important for me, the existential crisis today is looking and working towards climate change. That for me is vital. So this is what my query is, that why is there no religious advocacy group working precisely and focused with focus on climate change? That's my question. I don't know if you can answer it, or if why is that missed out? It is the most important thing. And how is it missed out, and why is it missed out?
Thanks, Mudita. I appreciate that as someone who cares very much about that personally. And I would say it's there. Actually, the work on climate is present in those groups, but it's a little bit hidden because it's not in the name. But in fact, for example, the Committee on Migration has a subcommittee that is dedicated to how the effects of climate change or other environmental disaster are affecting migrants or forcing people to migrate. As another example, within the Committee of Religious NGOs, there is a working group that is dedicated to climate concerns and meets, I think, even more frequently than the larger group meets to organize around those issues. Certainly, the Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is de facto very engaged in following issues of land grabbing, especially in important natural spaces like the Amazon, the Congo Basin. There's great emphasis on protecting ecosystems by protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples to continue protecting those lands as they have for so long. Another group that has some emphasis, some dedication to environment is absolutely the mining working group, which has kind of as its it has mining in the name, but really one of its key goals is to protect the right to drinking water. And that means protecting waterways as a whole, and to protect soils and waters from environmental degradation that happens in the case of mining. So I agree with you totally, that climate concerns need a prioritized place in our work. And I think that they do, but it's a little more subtle in terms of the names of the groups, but it's definitely a priority that we see exercised among the religious who are working here at the UN. But you just have to go a little bit below the surface to see where it's happening.
Thank you.
And I did see another question in the chat box, which was if it's possible for any of you to participate in this conference in person in New York in July. So that would be organized on an organization by organization basis. JCoR itself does not have a program through which to facilitate people coming to New York, but if your congregation has a representative at the UN, you could contact them directly to inquire if there is a possibility of coming, either if you're able to find your own funds or if they have some that are available. That would be something to inquire directly with your congregation, your organization, if they have an office at the UN. But otherwise, we will do our very best to make the conference accessible to you online as much as possible, and to help you feel connected and integrated into the process. And I see one more hand, Victor Bousquet. Please go ahead, Victor.
Good morning, Teresa. How are you? Good morning, everyone. I don't know if there are more members in this group. I'm a lay person. I work with the Religious of the Sacred Heart, the RSCJs, and I wanted to highlight certain aspects in your answer to Mudita, which are related to the need, on one hand, to have a political view, which is what was implied in your first part of the meeting, how the political participation is important, religious, and secondly, also in the way we present the basic. When Pope Francis talks about the common home and talks about the need of having a political position, we need to have a system that has a point of view on humanity, in which there are people that no person should be discardable. And this highlights the relationship between climate change and poverty and identity and education and etc. All the topics. Those topics cannot be approached individually. They are articulated as a whole. And if politics tries to separate them, we should insist on having a common view on them. And as a layperson, I'm very involved in networking. Networking is very important, and I saw that in your presentation. But it's not just interaction or the networking with other congregations or other NGOs, but also between the religious inside our faith. It should be networking that is not just based on a particular project, on a particular type of work, but also a general approach to networking, to being interlinked also even a spiritual approach. We need to be different. But I believe that the spirit of charismatic families gives this transcendental view, but assuming also human problematics. There is spiritual, no Catholic spiritual tradition that forgets about the human aspect and also concentrates on an abstract transcendence. The social teaching of the church assumes the human aspect of all concerns.
Point for us in our gathering today, in that I hope one of the outcomes from this overall journey and this overall program will be for all of you that we come together and we network, not only for the purpose of this forum and preparing for this forum, but that we are in fact building and strengthening a community among ourselves for which we are ready to respond and to learn about any new issue or any new observation to which we become aware, and to be ready to respond to it through whatever pathway is open to us, either at the UN level or within each of our respective countries. So I welcome you all into that community if you're joining us for the first time today. And I'm very much looking forward to the chance to continue learning together, preparing together, not only for this forum in July, but also for much longer term and a much broader community that is prepared to respond to the cries of the poor and the cries of the earth in an integrated way, to enable us to see the whole picture and to contribute in each place where we are able. So with that, I will conclude our meeting for today. I thank you for allowing these few extra minutes for our last remarks and questions. And please do watch your email boxes for messages from me in the next couple of days that will share, again, the content from today and the next actions that we will be taking as part of this program together. So I thank you very much for your accompaniment and your excellent listening and comments. And I will be in touch with you again very soon. Thanks very much, and have a great remainder of your day or your evening.
Good night from India. Good night from India.